The low hum of the engines filled the dimly lit cabin as the plane cruised steadily at 30,000 feet. Most passengers were dozing, headphones in, neck pillows propped awkwardly against seats, lulled into an uneasy sleep by the monotony of the red-eye flight. The air smelled faintly of reheated meals and coffee, mingling with the subtle chill of the air conditioning. Somewhere in the back, a baby let out a brief cry before falling silent again. It was the kind of flight where nothing unusual was expected, just a quiet passage from one destination to another. In seat 17C, a man sat alone, gazing out the small oval window at the endless black sky. He was unremarkable at first glance, dressed in a plain gray hoodie and jeans. His hood was pulled low, obscuring much of his face, though the sharp angle of his jaw and the faint streaks of silver in his hair hinted at someone in his 40s. He moved sparingly, his hands resting loosely in his lap, exuding an aura of quiet detachment. Around him, passengers shifted in their seats, murmuring softly or scrolling through glowing phone screens. The man seemed entirely unaffected by his surroundings, lost in his own thoughts. But if anyone had looked closer, they might have noticed the tension in his shoulders, the deliberate stillness of his posture, and the way his sharp brown eyes tracked even the slightest movement in the cabin. He wasn't just staring out the window, he was observing, assessing, cataloging. He had the look of someone who had seen too much, someone who was always prepared for the worst. 3 rows ahead, a group of 4 men exchanged glances, their faces tight with unease. They sat scattered, but kept darting subtle, almost imperceptible signals to one another. Their postures were rigid, their hands fidgeting near their carry-ons. No one seemed to notice them, no one except the man in 17C, who had clocked their movements the moment they boarded. He watched them out of the corner of his eye, his expression neutral but his mind alert. Something was off. A sudden click broke the rhythm of the flight. One of the men ahead stood abruptly, yanking a black mask over his face. The other 3 followed suit in perfect synchronization. Gasps rippled through the cabin as the passengers jolted awake, confusion quickly giving way to fear. "Everybody stay seated!" barked the man nearest the aisle, holding up a weapon. His voice cut through the cabin like a whip, silencing the murmurs. No sudden moves, no heroics, and nobody gets hurt. The quiet man in 17C didn't flinch. While others froze in fear, his eyes remained calm and calculating, scanning the masked men, their weapons, their stances. He stayed perfectly still, but his mind was racing. He wasn't frightened. He was waiting. The leader's voice echoed again, but this time it was directed at him. "You!" he shouted, pointing his weapon. "Get up, now!" The man sighed softly and rose to his feet. His hood fell back, revealing a chiseled face hardened by years of discipline. Calmly, he said, "Are you sure you want to do this?" The cabin descended into chaos as whispers turned into muffled cries, and passengers clutched each other for comfort. The leader of the masked men, tall and broad-shouldered, stepped closer to the quiet passenger, his weapon trained steadily. His men began moving down the aisle, barking orders for everyone to stay seated and keep their hands visible. Flight attendants, visibly shaking, complied as they were ushered toward the back of the plane. The quiet passenger stood calmly, his hands slightly raised, eyes fixed on the leader without a hint of panic. The 2 locked eyes for a moment that seemed to stretch endlessly. The leader sneered. "What's with the tough guy act? You think you're smarter than me? Sit down, or I'll make an example out of you." The passenger's lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "I'm just trying to figure out if you're bluffing or if you really know what you're doing." The leader's grip on the weapon tightened, his knuckles whitening. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice, but letting the menace drip from his words. "I don't bluff, buddy. Sit down, or I'll—" Before he could finish, a sharp voice from the back of the plane interrupted him. "What do you want from us? Money? Just tell us, please." A middle-aged woman, tears streaming down her face, pleaded with one of the other hijackers. The leader snapped his head in her direction, momentarily distracted. The quiet passenger seized the opportunity. In a single, fluid motion, he stepped forward, grabbing the barrel of the weapon with one hand, while driving his other elbow into the leader's throat. The man staggered back, choking, as the weapon clattered to the floor. Gasps rippled through the cabin as passengers ducked instinctively, heads disappearing below the seats. The hijacker closest to the leader spun around, his weapon drawn, but he was too slow. The quiet passenger moved with the precision of a trained predator, closing the distance in seconds. A sharp kick to the hijacker's wrist sent the weapon flying, and an open palm strike to the jaw sent him sprawling into the aisle. The other two hijackers hesitated, glancing at one another, their confidence shaken by the sudden, calculated assault. "Get him!" the leader rasped, clutching his throat as he struggled to recover. The cabin exploded into chaos again. Passengers screamed and cowered as the remaining hijackers charged toward the quiet passenger, one pulling a knife from his waistband. The man dodged the first attack with ease, his movements almost elegant, as he sidestepped the blade and delivered a quick, devastating punch to the attacker's ribs. A second blow to the temple sent the man crumpling to the ground. The last hijacker, younger and visibly less experienced than the others, froze in place, his hands trembling as he held his weapon aloft. His eyes darted between his incapacitated comrades and the unyielding figure before him. "Don't come any closer," he stammered, his voice betraying his fear. The quiet passenger tilted his head, his expression calm, but his voice edged with steel. "You don't want to do this, kid. Put it down before this gets worse." The young hijacker hesitated, his grip faltering as his fear overwhelmed him. The leader, still wheezing but recovering, snarled, "Don't listen to him! Do it!" But it was too late. The young man dropped the weapon, raising his hands in surrender. The quiet passenger kicked the discarded gun down the aisle, out of anyone's reach, and gestured for the young man to sit down. By now, passengers were beginning to realize that the tide had turned. Murmurs of hope rippled through the cabin as the quiet passenger stood tall, his presence commanding. The leader, seething with rage, made a desperate lunge toward the cockpit door, pulling a small device from his pocket. "I'll blow this plane apart before I let you ruin my plans," he roared. The quiet passenger's eyes narrowed. His voice dropped to a chilling calm. "That's not a detonator," he said simply, taking a step forward. "You're bluffing." The leader's hand hovered over the device, sweat dripping from his brow. "You don't know that," he barked, but his voice wavered. "Oh, I do." The quiet passenger took another step closer. "Because if it was real, you wouldn't be hesitating. You're scared, and scared men make mistakes." The leader's composure cracked. With a roar of frustration, he hurled the device at the floor and charged at the quiet passenger, fists raised. But it was like watching a storm crash against a mountain. The quiet passenger sidestepped the wild attack, grabbed the leader's arm mid-swing, and twisted it behind his back with a brutal efficiency that sent him crashing to the ground. With the leader pinned and the other hijackers subdued, the cabin fell silent, save for the sound of passengers weeping with relief. The quiet passenger knelt beside the leader, tightening his grip to ensure the man couldn't move. "It's over," he said, his voice low and final. The leader glared up at him, his face twisted with fury. "Who the hell are you?" he spat. The quiet passenger leaned in, his expression calm but unyielding. "Someone who doesn't like bullies." Just then, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've been informed of the situation in the cabin and are coordinating with ground authorities. Please remain calm and seated as we prepare for an emergency landing." Applause erupted in the cabin as passengers began to process what had just happened. The quiet passenger stood, handing the leader off to a pair of flight attendants who had regained their courage. He took a deep breath, his calm exterior betraying no hint of the adrenaline still coursing through him. One of the passengers, an elderly man sitting nearby, spoke up, his voice quivering with awe. "Sir, what you did back there, how did you know what to do?" The quiet passenger hesitated, his eyes distant for a moment, as if replaying a memory only he could see. Finally, he answered, "It's not the first time I've had to make a tough call." Another passenger, emboldened by his quiet humility, chimed in. "You're not just any guy, are you? You've done this kind of thing before." The quiet passenger gave a small, almost sheepish smile, his voice soft. "I've had some training." Before he could say more, a sharp gasp came from a woman in the back of the plane. She pointed at the corner of his hoodie, where the fabric had shifted just enough to reveal the edge of a patch on his sleeve, a symbol of valor and distinction. Whispers of recognition swept through the cabin. That's a military insignia," someone murmured. Another voice added, "He's a soldier, a decorated one." The quiet passenger said nothing, but his silence spoke volumes. Suddenly, the weight of his actions and the depth of his experience became clear to everyone on board. They weren't just saved by a man, they were saved by a warrior, someone who had faced far worse and emerged unbroken. As the plane began its descent, the passengers looked at him with a newfound respect, their gratitude etched in their tear-streaked faces. But the quiet passenger remained as he was, calm, composed, and focused, his eyes fixed out the window on the horizon ahead. As the plane began its descent, the cabin buzzed with whispered conversations and murmured prayers of relief. The passengers were no longer gripped by fear, but by awe and gratitude for the man who had single-handedly turned the tide of the hijacking. The quiet passenger, however, remained as unassuming as he'd been at the start of the flight. He sat back in his seat, eyes fixed on the horizon outside the window, his breathing steady, as if the entire ordeal had been just another day in his life. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom once more. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are making an emergency landing at the nearest airport. Ground authorities and emergency personnel will be waiting to assist. Please remain seated and follow the instructions of the crew." A wave of applause rippled through the cabin, but the quiet man didn't react. He leaned his head back against the seat and closed his eyes briefly, as though mentally replaying every move he'd made. The landing was smooth, though tense. Emergency vehicles lined the tarmac as the plane taxied to a stop, their flashing lights illuminating the dark runway. The masked men, subdued and disarmed, sat under the watchful eyes of flight attendants and passengers who had regained their confidence. The quiet passenger, still seated, glanced at them briefly, his gaze sharp but void of hatred. They were no longer a threat, just broken men desperate for something they couldn't achieve. As the cabin door opened, a flood of police officers and emergency responders boarded the plane. The leader of the hijackers was the first to be hauled off in cuffs, snarling curses under his breath. The younger hijacker followed, his head hung low in shame, while the others offered no resistance. Passengers cheered as the hijackers were led away, their cheers growing louder when one officer asked, "Who's the person responsible for taking them down?" All eyes turned toward the quiet man in 17C. He shifted uncomfortably under the weight of their collective gaze. A few passengers began clapping, and soon the entire cabin erupted into applause. He gave a small, reluctant nod of acknowledgement, but remained seated, clearly not seeking attention. A senior officer approached him, his posture respectful but firm. "Sir, I've been briefed on the situation. We'd like to ask you a few questions about what happened." The quiet man stood, his height and presence commanding even without effort. He reached into his back pocket, pulling out an ID and handing it to the officer. The officer's eyebrows rose as he read the credentials. "Special Forces, huh?" he said, glancing up at the man. "I should have known." The man gave a faint smile but said nothing, taking back his ID. "I'll answer your questions," he said finally, his voice steady but low. "But I'd prefer to keep this as quiet as possible. I didn't do this for recognition." The officer nodded in understanding. "We'll do our best, sir. Thank you for everything." As the passengers disembarked, many stopped by to personally thank the quiet man. A mother with 2 young children wiped tears from her eyes as she spoke. "I don't know what we would have done without you. My kids, they're everything to me. Thank you." Her voice broke as she hugged him, and though he stiffened slightly, he patted her back gently. A young boy, no older than 8, walked up to him shyly. "Are you a real soldier?" he asked, his voice filled with wonder. The man crouched down to the boy's level and nodded. "I am," he said simply. "Like a hero?" the boy pressed. The man chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Heroes are just people who do what needs to be done. You remember that, okay?" The boy nodded solemnly and saluted him, a gesture that made the man smile faintly before returning the salute. A flight attendant approached him next, holding back tears. I froze. I'm supposed to protect my passengers, but I couldn't even move. And then you saved us all." Her voice cracked, and she looked at him with a mix of admiration and guilt. "You did your job," he said gently. "You kept calm. That's what matters." As the last of the passengers exited the plane, the quiet man lingered, standing near the now empty aisle. He looked out the window at the flashing emergency lights and the chaos on the tarmac. His mind wandered to the faces of the hijackers, their fear, their desperation, and the choices that had led them to this moment. He wasn't one to judge, but he couldn't help but wonder what had pushed them to such extremes. He retrieved his small carry-on bag from the overhead compartment and made his way to the exit. The captain and first officer stood at the doorway, waiting for him. "I just wanted to say thank you," the captain said, extending his hand. "You kept this plane in the air. I owe you my life, and the lives of everyone on board." The quiet man shook his hand firmly. "You got us here safely, Captain. That's what matters." As he stepped onto the tarmac, the cool night air hit his face. He inhaled deeply, letting the adrenaline drain from his body. Emergency personnel offered him rides and assistance, but he declined, heading toward the terminal on foot. Inside the terminal, his phone buzzed incessantly with missed calls and messages. He sighed, unlocking it to see texts from an old friend, his commanding officer, and even a news alert about the incident. He swiped through them absently, his thoughts elsewhere. Sitting down on a bench near the departure gates, he scrolled through the news coverage. The story was already trending. "Hijacking thwarted mid-flight by mysterious passenger." He shook his head, the corners of his mouth twitching into a rueful smile. He didn't need fame or attention. He just wanted peace. But as he stared at the screen, something shifted inside him. This wasn't the first time he'd been thrust into the role of protector. It probably wouldn't be the last. The world was full of people like those hijackers, desperate, angry, willing to hurt others to make their voices heard. And it was full of innocent people caught in the crossfire. The quiet man leaned back against the bench, his eyes distant. Maybe it was time to stop running from his past. He still had the skills, the discipline, the drive. Maybe there was a way to use them. Not for war, but for peace. For protection. He opened a blank email draft and began typing, his fingers moving steadily over the screen. It was time to reach out to old contacts, to rebuild the bridges he'd let crumble. There was work to be done. Before leaving the terminal, the quiet man stopped at a small gift shop near the exit. He bought a small toy airplane and tucked it into his bag, thinking of the young boy who had saluted him. It was a small gesture, but it mattered. Every action mattered. As he stepped into the night, the city stretched before him, alive with possibility. The events of the day had shaken him, but they had also awakened something he thought he'd buried long ago, a sense of purpose. He pulled his hood up over his head, blending into the crowd as he walked toward the parking lot. No one knew his name, and that was exactly how he wanted it. But as the headlines spread and the passengers shared their stories, one thing became clear. A quiet man had reminded them all that courage doesn't always shout. It often whispers, steady and unyielding, in the face of chaos. And with that, he disappeared into the night, leaving behind a plane full of people forever changed by the man who didn't hesitate to stand when it mattered most.